Yo, what's up guys, welcome back to another video. This is a reaction to why did so many Germans immigrate to the United States. And I mean, I know there's a lot of people with German ancestry who live in the US, but I didn't realize that, like, especially in the northern side, not just in the north, but specifically like in the northern sides of the US, it's a very high percentage of German people or people with German descent who live in those regions and just in the US as a whole. And I don't know from when. Was it from the early days of the US? Or was it from like after World War II? I don't know when this influx of German people moved to the US or travelled to the US. I don't want to say moved because it was a bit different. You're sailing back in the 1700s, you know. But yeah, I mean, I just don't really understand because I would have always assumed it was like mostly British people or French or Spanish, which probably, like, in terms of like people of Spanish descent, maybe it is higher, but yeah, people of German descent is very high, and it's just fascinating to me. I don't really know the necessary reasons behind it, so we're here to learn about it. Hopefully going to enjoy. I'm going to assume probably 20% of you watching this reaction will be of German descent, so yeah, let's get into this. And also, if you are, do you still speak German, or do you just sort of hold like the German name that you know that you're from Germany or your family came from Germany? Like, will the languages be passed down? I assume they probably won't because some people will have lived there for centuries at this point. But yeah, let me know in the comments and let's check this out. Let's check this out.
According to the United States Census Bureau, the largest ethnic group in the United States of America is German. In 2019, a whopping 43 million Americans described themselves as being of full or partial German ancestry, with Pennsylvania alone accounting for 3.5 million. So, there is no doubt that at some point in time, there were a lot of German immigrants crossing the Atlantic to reach America. But what exactly was the reason? What made so many Germans decide to leave all they'd ever known and owned behind to start a new life in the United States of America? The first notable wave of German settlers in the American colonies came near the end of the 17th century when William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, invited religious outcasts from Germany to come and settle in his colony. Many, facing religious persecution back home, eagerly accepted the invitation. For the following decades, German immigration to the colony would steadily increase. For the most part, these settlers were emigrating from the more southwestern regions of Germany, such as Baden, Württemberg, Palatinate, and the Rhineland. But they would not be the only Germans to make their way to Pennsylvania. By midway through the 1700s, these settlers had founded multiple cities, such as Germantown, Skipack, and Conestoga. Upwards of 65,000 Germans had only recently made their way to the welcoming colony by the 1770s. But unfortunately, the influx of German immigrants would drastically decrease as the colonies inched closer and closer to the Revolutionary War. Numerous of the tens of thousands of settlers had left Germany not just for religious freedom, but also to flee from the effects of the 30 Years' War and subsequent conflicts that plagued Germany. Seeing such a large-scale war then break out in the New World, the dream of a new, safe, and promising home was shattered for many. For those who had already arrived in the colonies, though, life was not horrible. Though challenging, it seems that success in the New World was a true possibility for the hard-working immigrants. According to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the typical German immigrant was a poor farmer or artisan who arrived around 1750 with a wife and 2 children. They were most likely in debt for the passage across the Atlantic, but had family or friends already settled in America. They were affiliated with the Lutheran or Reformed Church, but only loosely committed to an organized religion. Records indicate that they became prosperous members of the community. However, many were too poor to pay the transatlantic passage, so as many as 1/2 to 2/3 of German immigrants came to Pennsylvania as indentured servants or redemptioners, as Germans called them. These redemptioners were essentially contracted servants for generally between 2 to 7 years, who would be forced to work for a particular employer to make up for the debts they owed and had incurred from their trip to America. And by the time the German influx had slowed, there were already, according to some historians, nearly 75,000 Germans living in Pennsylvania, and many
just in Pennsylvania at this point. Oh, okay.
others had immigrated to the rest of the colonies or would come later on. There had been an almost constant trickle of Germans entering the New World ever since the founding of Jamestown. And even some of the German Hessian soldiers that had been employed by the British during the American Revolution had decided to stay in the United States at the end of the war. During the early 1800s, more Germans had begun to make their way to America, though not in as large of waves due to famine back home. Others would come a few decades later due to the political strife in Germany, and during the 1850s, roughly 1 million Germans arrived in the United States, making the total number of German-born Americans by the 1860s around 1.3 million.
Jeez,
in the
high
1870s, over 100...
So 1.3 million. Wait, 1.3 million? Let's just go back. In, 160 years ago?
1870s, over 100,000 Germans from Russia found their way to America after the Tsarist. Over 100,000 Germans from Russia, born Americans by the 1860s.
1.3 million German-born Americans
60s
in 1860, so 160 years ago. And now we're at over 40 plus million people of German descent. That's a big jump up. So I guess the world wars will have played a big factor then. I guess we're going to see that soon.
Around 1.3 million. In the 1870s, over 100,000 Germans from Russia found their way to America after the Tsarist government stripped away privileges that had been granted to German farmers in Russia hundreds of years prior. The next decade would outshine all the rest though, as around 1.5 million Germans came to the US just in the 1880s alone.
What?
This would be the peak though, as the number of German-born Americans dropped from 2.9 million to 2.3 million between 1890 and 1910. Immigration had gone down drastically, and in 1920, the number had fallen even further, now sitting at 1.7 million. And even with the side effects of displacement caused by World War II, Americans born in Germany still only added up to 1.2 million after the start of the conflict. Germans would continue to immigrate over the following decades, as they still do today, but the number of them coming to America has nevertheless dropped remarkably. In 1990, only 58 million Americans claimed to be German or partially German, even though others could be linked to German ancestors. But still, even if the number of Germans coming into America had already reached its high point, they have undoubtedly had a huge impact on the country. And it does seem that German remains the most dominant ethnic group in the country. The reasons for their migration are multiple. One reason that is often overlooked, though didn't account for the first wave of immigrants, was the stories told by Germans who had already made their new lives in America with great success. From Gottfried Duden's book to simple letter correspondence between German immigrants and those they knew back home, people in Germany began to hear about the opportunities and freedoms that the colonies and later United States had to offer. Simple word of mouth is often all it takes, but still, there were many
especially in these times, that's what people are going off. People, like what people say about another place or whatever they say about anything, people are going to take that a lot more seriously than they would now, right? Because you couldn't really have any other opinion because someone who's been there is the best opinion. Obviously now you can go on your phone and see stuff and it gives you a bit of a better perspective of things, but it's pretty fascinating, to be honest. I mean, I never used to realize like how many Germans were actually in the US or people from Germany. So it is fascinating to learn that a lot of the people who went there were just hearing things, like you said, word of mouth and looking for a better life, which I guess is why a lot of people went to the US, but just a lot more Germans than other people, I guess.
other factors that led to Germans crossing the ocean. For many, the feudal system back home left them yearning for more independence, as did other restrictions that have been placed on some, such as limits on marriages due to a fear of overpopulation and a worsening economy. But the economy was already bad enough for numerous people. High taxes were a constant burden, and making a respectable living just seemed more likely in the New World, with news of land being given to new settlers and industrialization later opening the door for more jobs outside of the typical farming. Furthermore, some communities in the German states were eager to get
What is love, baby, don't hurt me? What the fuck?
rid of the lower class anyway, and would even offer to cover the costs of the journey to America if the immigrants promised to never return home. Other German men left illegally due to military service requirements, while more fled famine and frequent wars. And of course, as demonstrated by many of the original immigrants to the New World, religious freedom was often an important motivator. At the time, many were essentially told what to believe in, Catholicism or Protestantism, for example, by each monarch. For those with strong alternative beliefs who were unwilling to comply, fleeing the country became a way for them to practice their faith in peace. Not only did the American colonies have freedom of religion, but as stated earlier, the founder of Pennsylvania himself had even invited these religious outcasts to settle in his colony. Of course, many reasons exist as to why people of any country immigrate to another, and this is far from an exhaustive list, though it is some of the main explanations that have been discovered. Without German immigrants, for example, Americans may not share the tradition of decorated Christmas trees, and the Brooklyn Bridge wouldn't have been built without a German immigrant engineer, business owners, military generals, scientists. There are dozens upon dozens of names of German immigrants who took the journey across the Atlantic and changed the future of the colonies and the United States. Today, Germans still immigrate to the US on occasion, but more significantly is the lasting effects of those who had already come. 6 states are believed to have over 30% of their total populations be made up by full or partial German Americans. Another 7 have an at least 20%
New Mexico, I wasn't expecting that.
ethnic German population, and of all 50 states, not a single one has a German population that makes up less than 4.5% of the state's entire population. Possibly one of the most impressive parts about this is that most immigrants from the German states have assimilated almost, if not entirely, into German American culture and identity, meaning that there really hasn't been an intentional preservation of German identity in America, though some German heritage societies and communities exist. For the most part, it's all thanks to the millions of people who braved the waters to start a new life in the United States that have made so much of America's roots German.
Damn, there we go. Fascinating look into, I guess, the German influence in the US and all that stuff. My hometown is Frederick, Maryland. Used to be super German. Germans from Pennsylvania came down and settled. German was one of the main languages up till the mid-80s. See, that fascinates me, right? Because this is what 100. So he's the mid 1800s. So I'm gonna say 1850. So 170 plus years ago, they were still like speaking German as the main language in US cities. Like that's one of the fascinating things about the US being such a new country relatively. Like there's probably still cities. I'm gonna say there's probably cities in the US, right, or areas or regions or towns or whatever that speak another language as the main language, which maybe isn't really a shock to people from the US because obviously you know a lot more about the history than me. But for me, going into this and initially when I used to do these reactions, that would not even have crossed my mind. I would have just assumed that wouldn't be the case. But there's probably some videos out there of some like towns in the US where you wouldn't really expect, like if you actually learn about the town, you wouldn't realize it's in the US or you wouldn't expect it to be in the US or whatever. I don't know if that's a thing, but if there is, if you even understand what I'm saying, please let me know if there's any videos out there of these fascinating areas in the US where people will like live a life that you wouldn't expect to be in the US. I guess it's like Amish communities for starters, right? But yeah, let me know in the comments if what I'm saying makes sense. Let me know. And yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this reaction. Until next time, like, subscribe. Peace.